Today I wanted to talk about forms. It's not that exciting, really, but it is something that we tend to have to work with a lot as kind of web developers. And so I think it's like quite important, especially if you have an application that relies extremely heavily on forms, right? If you have junior developers or even like yourselves as like, senior or intermediate or whatever level you're at, you kind of don't want to spend a long time having to repeat the same thing with forms. So typically an app will have some sort of style guide. You'll have to like apply the same classes. You'll have to like kind of redo these defaults every time if you're sticking to this kind of typical HTML form structure. And so I think maybe a year ago, myself and one of our other front-end developers, we got together and kind of sat down and thought, okay, what would a form look like if we were to create something for ourselves? And we decided that it had to have convention over configuration to kind of stick with the Ember kind of ethos. And so it would try and provide things like sane defaults and kind of make decisions that we thought would be best for our application and for our developers. It had to really, what it boiled down to was it had to provide minimal fuss, but also complete flexibility. So we had to provide these sane defaults, but allow any developer at any point in time to jump in and do things their way, right? Because one solution doesn't always fit all, especially when it comes to things like forms. And it kind of had to be like, at its base, at its very kind of basic implementation, pretty simple, easy to understand. Had to follow things like normal HTML conventions when it came to things like events and other properties that you would attach to these. Yeah, so you start with something like this, which is a fairly simple form. And this is a form taken from our application. And this is actually using the solution that we came up with. But this isn't actually very difficult, right? This is one of the most simplest forms in our application. We have a text area. We have like some errors here because the address can't be blank. We have a selector, which is a countries, US states, quantities, which is a number field, and then another message text area down the bottom, and then two buttons, save and close. So this is a very simple form. But then you get also quite complex forms. So this is another form that we have, which is probably one of the most complex forms in our application. I would say second most complex. But we have a selector which searches every user that works here at the company. We have a client contact which belongs to like a different model. We have other select boxes. We have this duration field, client availability, a whole bunch of things going on. And to add to that, there's a lot of stuff that's going on in the background, right? So we have a whole date picker over here that has like, it yields each day, and then each day can have different properties attached to that. This field is actually displayed in minutes, but it's stored in seconds. Here we have time zones, which is, a whole world unto its own. But here we're like converting, this is a conversion of that time zone against this time zone, and then we display that output there. We have actions, we have radio buttons, we have like combined fields down the bottom here. So it's like very complex form. And this is the exact type of thing that we wanted to set out to solve. We wanted to say, how can we build something that takes something like a very simple form all the way through to something that's a little bit more complex and still carry the same conventions? And yeah, it was a little bit challenging, but I think what we ended up coming up with, I don't think is unique. I think it's been done before with other forms, though I think some aspects of it are like pretty interesting and quite unique. So yeah, what we wanted to have was field errors, labels. We wanted to be able to disable fields. We wanted to be able to disable the whole form if we wanted to. We wanted consistent styles so that the developer never has to think about, if they have an input, they shouldn't have to think like, what class do I need to attach to this input to get it to look like the 50 million other inputs in my app. It should be easy for testing. If we're building our own form, then we should like take liberty, right? And we should add things that are going to make testing easier for us. And then we can build helpers on top of that as well. And it should also be really adaptable. So it should be able to support future field types. So it should be very pluggable. And we're always thinking, right? We always wanted to get to this like minimal fuss but complete flexibility. That was the aim over everything. And yeah, it was like a bit of a challenge for Andre and I. And really, there are two things that you need to kind of to grasp in order to understand how the form works. The first one is contextual components. Is everyone familiar with contextual components? Okay, cool. That should be easy. And then the second one is this concept of proxy objects or change sets. If you've used Ember change set, are people familiar with these as well? Okay. I'm going to go over them anyway. But what are contextual components? So I think it was like a year and a half ago, maybe a little bit longer, maybe a little bit shorter, give or take a few months. But you previously, if you wanted to have this concept of like a nested component, you couldn't really do it. So you could namespace them, but you couldn't have like a concept of like this component. So in this instance, you have my component, you pass in a user. It might need some knowledge about like that user. Then you have a label, an input, errors, select. And you couldn't have this concept of like, well, this label component is actually a child of my component, right? There's an inherent relationship there, and that could only be defined by the namespacing or by the structure of your application in the folders that was. And also you have like, you have a bunch of repetitiveness here. So you have the user, and then because there's no shared context here, you have to pass the user into each one. And I think a lot of us would probably have situations like this in some of our apps. I know we do with some widgets and weird things like that where they've got headers and then content and then footers. But this was a pretty typical scenario. But obviously it's like not very good. It's not ideal. There's a lot of repetitiveness. It's not very clear. It's not very easy to read and understand. So the solution they came up with was this idea of a component helper. So we're all familiar with helpers. Oh, I have white space there, and that's driving me nuts. But you have this concept of the hash helper. People familiar with the hash helper? Essentially, it will take these. This is actually wrong, but that's okay. We'll roll with it. But essentially, it will yield this hash. And what you would have is you would say like, label equals component. And then you would have input equals component, errors equals component. And you can kind of think of that as like a normal object, and the key will be label, and the value will be this component, which is not actually evaluated yet. It's not evaluated till you call on that argument that's yielding out into that hash. And so this is basically the essence of contextual components, because now I no longer need to, as a developer, right, not as an add-on implementer. So this is what you would have as an add-on implementer, and you still have this concept of like repetition here. But I think that's okay. That's okay because as an add-on developer, you're designing an API. You're not like reusing this in multiple areas of your application. But as a developer, you just want the benefits of this. And that's what this helper is all about. That's what this contextual component is all about. It's designed to make it easier for add-on developers and for like, developers in your team to build components that expose some level of an API to make the job easier of building your application. So yeah, you can see here that I pass in user to my top level. So this is my component.js, and I pass in disabled here. And then I can pass this into each one. And then essentially what that's going to look like, we'll look at in a bit. But then it changes the thing here quite dramatically because I can yield, I get an argument back called like component or something. I can name it whatever I want. And then all I need to do is component.label, and that's it. I don't need to do the disabled or the user anymore because that's all getting passed in through the my component. Okay, so that's contextual components. What are proxy objects? I'm sure in some of our applications, or perhaps like earlier on in the days of Ember, this would have been a pretty typical scenario. So you would have had your form, it would have had first name, last name, email, and that was probably directly two-way bound to like your model or some form of that, perhaps like an alias on your controller or your component. But this was a pretty typical scenario. But this is not ideal because the Ember store is global, And so that state, when you mutate it, is changed everywhere in your application. And then you as a developer, you've gone from, trying to update first name to having to go back and roll back global state. And that just shouldn't be like a concern that we have to worry about. And so there's this concept of a proxy object. I think in Ember, it's like ember.objectProxy, or change sets. So these are kind of similar things. Change set is a similar concept, but essentially what you're doing is you're populating your proxy object using defaults from the content. And then when you change these, you're only changing them on this proxy object or this change set. And only when that change set or this like kind of middle person here is valid or is in a state that you're happy with, do you then persist that back. And the advantage of this is that if my user decides to fill in this form and then cancel, because this is all within a component, I don't have to do any cleanup. I just have to throw it all away and forget that the thing ever happened. I've not mutated any global state here. All I've done is create an object, populate it with some defaults, and then throw it away. So that's kind of the concept of a proxy object or change sets. So yeah, these give us like really good things though, things that don't necessarily are that easy to use on an Ember model, because these can be just plain POJOs. These don't have to be anything special. And so because of that, we can create our own conventions around these. So we can do validations, we can have temporary properties like password and then password confirmation, and then we can have something in there like a function that compares them to make sure they're correct. We don't have needless store creation. So if I want to create a new record, I don't have to create that until the object that I'm actually mutating, this proxy object, is in a valid state and can be persisted back. And I also avoid two-way binding, and I stick to this principle of actions, actions up, data down, or data down, actions up, one of the two. Okay, so back to forms. So this is really a kind of brief look of how we do the forms at Alpha Sites. There's like a lot more in here that I would love to cover, but honestly, I could keep going forever, so I kind of have to like scope myself. But essentially, this is the XForm component. Okay, so if you think about our my component before, this is the component that we've generated, the form component, and it's called XForm because naming things is hard. And so here we have just a plain component, and what this does is it yields out a few different contextual components. This isn't an exhaustive list. I cut this down a little bit to kind of simplify it. But we have a text area. Actually, I should start at the start. The first thing you get passed in is a change set, and then a global disabled global disabled state. And the reason for this is because if you imagine that your application uses modals, or they go to a page and then you require to load like 5 other different models, like in the case of that scheduling form that we had before, you don't want your users to be able to interact with this form yet, right? Because it's not ready. And so we have the option here to just pass disable in as true, and that can be running off something like an Ember concurrency task. And as soon as that task stops running and is idle, the whole form will be enabled, and all our data will be in there. So we can use Ember concurrency tasks now to control the whole state of our form with just one property. And because we're using contextual components, these just get passed into every other field. And then we have like classes which get applied, and then the XForm has like a special CSS file which then makes everything look the same, right? So everything can be disabled. There is a drawback here which I'll go into later, which I'm still trying to solve. So we yield out a hash, we have text area select, and under the hood this select is really just a power select. So you're doing that whole concept of like, there are these solutions out there that exist, things like power select or power calendar, that are really great, right? And we don't want to lose those benefits by like trying to reinvent the wheel. So what we've done here is we yield out a select, and the underlying component there is actually just a power select. And then we provide like defaults even onto that power select. We have a plain old input, and then a button and a label. Okay, so if we dive in to that input component, this is what that input component looks like. And if you imagine what a form is and you imagine what a field, or what we call an element is, we've decided that elements are made up of three things. An element on a form is made up of a label, a field, and an error list. And so you have, in that first example, the label would have been name. The field will be whatever the input is for that particular element. And then the error list is basically a list of errors. And so at any point, you can use all of these, you can use none of these. If you want just the field, you don't have to have the label. You just wouldn't do like form.label or whatever. If you don't want the field, for example, you can do that. I have an example later where I can actually demonstrate some of this in action. So if we dive down a little bit further, let's have a look at the field. So here we have this is an example of taking a bit of liberty as an add-on developer, or as a kind of developer building an API in this init where we define a computed property. But essentially it's a very simple thing, right? The tag name is just input. Then we have a few attribute bindings for some normal kind of HTML attributes, value, disabled, read-only, placeholder, type, right? So we have default support for things like number or email or website or anything like that. And then we apply our kind of class names, which are specific to this particular X form. We do things like autofocus. So these are things that there is an HTML5 attribute, which is autofocus. But that only works if the page loads and it's the only input on the page, right? If you have a component that is in a modal or something like that, autofocus doesn't always work in that instance. So here again, we can take liberties and we can say, if you've provided autofocus, we do some quirky jQuery stuff in here to select it, which I removed, I think, to hide that shame. And then we do a few more things in the init. So we define a property here to watch the value, which I'll get into in the example. So each element also has a property, which it tells that element what field in the change set or proxy object it's responsible for. Because by default, this knows how to update itself. But that doesn't mean that you can't change it, which I'll dive into in a bit. And then we provide the default actions as well. So we expose those. So we say, if you've provided, as a developer, if you've provided me an action on input, I'm just going to yield up and I'm going to give you the event. And it's up to you what you want to do, right? If you don't provide that action, then the default is to just set that property onto the change set or the proxy object that you've passed in. So always trying to think, what is the sane default here? What's the expected thing? But then providing that complete flexibility for the developer to jump in and do whatever they want. Basically what this slide says. Okay, so an example. So here we have a form. I'll bring up the example controller. So here we have a controller. The root is just example. We don't have a root. We don't have a real Ember model either, so you'll just have to imagine that a little bit. But in init, we create this model, which you typically wouldn't do because a controller is a singleton. So this would only get loaded once, so typically this would happen in a root. So you'll have to forgive me. But then we set this real model. So we're basically faking the root action. You can see here that age, right, is stored in months. So I'm trying to replicate this tricky situation of something that's stored but then displayed differently. Then we have an action, which is log objects, which you'll see when we get to the form. And then another action there to set the age. So this is the form. So this is what it looks like in code. This is what it looks like on the page itself. First name Will, last name Raxworthy, age 30. And so if we walk through this form a little bit, first we use the xform component. I've used class names here because I didn't want to kind of do my own CSS, so I copied from a previous form just to get the kind of spacing and stuff like that right, to put it in the middle of the page. I'm using a change set, so we use change sets by default. But really, this could be anything. This could be a Ember object proxy, it could be a Pojo, it could be whatever you want. We just use change sets. And then in response, or what gets yielded out to you there is this form, this component, but you also get that change set back. And this is really important because this is what lets you have that complete flexibility over what your form elements will do. And then we have an input, so we do form.input. I tell it which property this element is looking after, which is name. I have a label, first name. By default, so if I was to get rid of this and just do this, by default, that's just going to take the property name that I have and capitalize it and just do name. I don't know, that seemed reasonable when we did it. But you can override that. You can yield out and you can do whatever you want. You can have a label that is like a select box now. You can have a label that is a picture or a like GIF or something like that, right? You can do whatever you want. Or you can just put first name, or you can just have the default. And then we do the input.field, and this is this bit here. So you can see already, right, we've created this change set. It's backed by our real model, which was name Will, last name Raxworthy. And just by doing this, it's given me this input, which then pre-populates my default values in there. Okay, so we have the same thing for last name, and then we have age again, which I'll get to in a second. And then down here we have a button. So we have this concept of a primary button, and then we have a concept of like a secondary button, which is just like a cancel or something like that. Oh, can everyone see that? So yeah, we pass primary true. I'm not a big fan of like passing primary true. If I could do it again, I would probably do button dash primary or something, but it's okay. And then we have an action here, which is on click. So by default, a button doesn't know what to do. You have to tell it what to do. So in this case, we're going to call log objects. So if we have a look at log objects, what's it going to do? It's going to log the real model, and then it's going to log each of the values of the change set, so name, last name, and age. And this is really just to prove that that the change set is working and that we're like updating these values as we want. So if I was to change this to James, and then I click this button here, you can see my original object, or my real model, hasn't been changed in any way. But my change set, the values have been changed. And only the ones that, although the ones that have that had those values are still the same values. And you can see, like by default, right, this is a pretty sane thing. You type in the input updates the change set, and then you get the change set back. So where it becomes a little bit trickier is here. So we have this age form, and the age form, we've decided we're going to store it in months, but when the user uses it, we want to show it to them in years, because that's a better way to view your age. And so this is an example of how we can go completely custom on this thing. So the default now is when I type in, if I go back to this example, and I type in something like 20, I want to see 20, but what I actually want to store on the change set is 240. All right, it's like stage fright. I didn't even want to try. So you can see, right? So by default, the value here would be changeset.age. But we're overriding that now, and we're saying if changeset.age is an integer, and I'll show you why we have to do this in a sec. So integer is a helper that we've made. If it's an integer, then divide changeset.age by 12. And if it's not an integer, so it's like null or text, just yield that text. And this is so that I can say something like, I didn't capture it, but in the scheduling form, if I was to type test, right, you don't want to show NaN. You want to validate, and you want to say, you've typed test, but this field should be a number. I can show a better example of that. It actually works. But yeah, so we check there, if it's an integer, divided by 12, otherwise show the age. And then on input, so rather than going with that default action of just updating the change set, we want to run our own action, which in this case is if there is a value, set the age to the value divided by 12, multiplied by 12. Otherwise, don't do anything. We don't want to do anything. So then when I type in here and I say something like 50, and then I hit save, you can see the change set is stored as 600s, but the value that is displayed in my input is still 50. So my user has no idea that what they're typing in is stored in months. But as a developer, I have full control to kind of like show that form exactly as I want. But I still get all the other benefits, right? So I still get all the classes. I still get all the all those other sane defaults. I get the error lists and everything like that. And if we look at the classes, we can see that we have like, we generate all of this stuff which is useful for testing. So we have like xform field -- name. So we use those properties because you've told us what that element is. And so we can use that to build class names, which in your QUnit tests, you can now just go, project form dot xform field -- name, check the value of that, and then off you go. You kind of don't need to like traverse this whole DOM down to like input. So yeah, we can take like a lot of liberties here, and we can provide like a really good experience for someone who's building a form. So yeah, like I said, there's a lot more that I could probably talk about here. So things like select boxes, some more like kind of complex examples of how you would structure this, how you might go about testing it, some other helpers that we've written to kind of make this stuff a little bit easier. I think I'm running out of time. Did anyone have any questions at all?
Is there any chance that example could be open sourced? I'd love to play with it.
Yeah, so the whole thing itself isn't open sourced, purely because originally it was changing so often as we kind of figured it out. I would love to open source it. I think there's another one called Ember Form 4, which is quite similar, which also handles things like change sets and stuff like that. It also does like translations. But yeah, I would love to open source it. I think kind of before that, there's like things like accessibility that I would also like to figure out, like how you would go about creating defaults for accessibility. Yeah, things like that. The other gotcha is, so here, right, I can disable an individual field. So I can say if this value is blank, then disable this particular field. Oh, just got shocked. So if I go back to my example template, I can say like here, disabled equals true. And then if I go back here, so age is now disabled, and you can see like this is an example of how I've given it one property, but it's changed everything about that field. But now if my form as a whole is dependent on a like running task, I've overridden the default here. So I then have to repeat this kind of like, if this task is running, disable this field as well, and this field. So there's like a few things like that that I'd kind of like to figure out. So like, how would you actually merge these disabled states so that you can still disable the whole form, but then have the ability to have kind of nested disabled states. Another thing you can do is you can provide like modifiers. So if you have instances where you want to style a field slightly differently, you can provide a modifier, and that will, so if you're familiar with BEM, it'll be xform field -- name -- something or other, and then you can like style that specific to your situation. So yeah, there's a ton of things that I'd probably love to change about it before then. Any other questions? Okay, cool. Thank you very much.